The photograph arrived at Fort Campbell 3 weeks before Captain Elena Vasquez did. It showed her shaking hands with a senator on the steps of the Capitol, dress uniform pristine, smile camera ready. The men of the 3rd Special Operations Squadron passed it around like evidence at a trial. "Public affairs," Sergeant First Class Marcus Webb said, dropping the image on the ready room table. "They're sending us a public affairs officer for the deployment." Chief Warrant Officer Danny Hollister picked up the photo, studied it, then set it down like it might contaminate him. "She's got jump wings? Probably bought them at the PX." The laughter that followed was quick and sharp, the kind of laughter that builds walls. They were a tight unit, these men. 12 years of deployments had welded them together in ways that transcended rank or regulation. They'd bled on 4 continents, buried friends in 3, and learned to trust each other with the kind of faith most people reserve for God. Now, 6 weeks before their rotation to a forward operating base in the Sahel region of Africa, command was inserting a stranger into their formation. A woman, a public affairs officer, someone whose job, as far as they could tell, was to make war look presentable for the evening news. Master Sergeant Cole Brennan sat apart from the others, cleaning his rifle with the methodical attention of a man who'd done the same thing 1,000 times. At 43, he was the oldest member of the squadron and the quietest. He'd seen enough deployments to know that assumptions were dangerous things, but even he felt the resistance settling into his chest like cold metal. The Army had its reasons for everything. That didn't mean the reasons were good. Captain Elena Vasquez arrived on a Tuesday morning in early March, stepping off a C-130 into the gray Kentucky dawn with a single duffel bag over her shoulder. She was smaller than the photograph suggested, with dark hair pulled back in a regulation bun and eyes that seemed to be taking measurements of everything around her. She walked with an economy of motion that suggested either efficiency or exhaustion. Webb was waiting on the tarmac, arms crossed, flanked by 2 other sergeants who wore their skepticism like body armor. "Captain Vasquez," he said, not quite a greeting. "Welcome to Fort Campbell. Sergeant Webb." She extended her hand. He took it briefly, the way you might handle something you weren't sure was safe. "I've read your file. Impressive operational history. We don't put much stock in files around here, ma'am." "Neither do I." She shouldered her duffel and started walking toward the hangar without waiting for an escort. "That's why I requested to deploy with your unit instead of observing from the rear." Webb exchanged glances with the men behind him. Whatever they'd expected, it wasn't this. The briefing room felt smaller with her in it. The 12 operators of 3rd Squadron sat in a loose semicircle while Captain Vasquez stood at the front, not behind the podium, but beside it, as if she knew that hiding behind furniture would only confirm their suspicions. "I know what you're thinking," she began. "Pentagon sent down a pretty face to document your mission for recruitment videos. Maybe write some feel-good stories for the base newsletter. Get some footage of you all looking heroic for the evening news back home." No one spoke. No one had to. "I'm not here to make you look good. I'm not here to get in your way. I'm here because 4 months ago, a special operations team in Niger got ambushed, and the American public didn't find out about it for 2 weeks. By then, the story was already being shaped by people who weren't there, who didn't understand what happened, who had agendas that had nothing to do with the men who died." She paused, letting the silence gather weight. "I'm here to make sure that if something happens to this unit, the truth is what survives. Not the version command wants to sell, not the version politicians find convenient. The truth." Hollister leaned forward. "And you think you can tell the difference between what's true and what's convenient?" "I think that's exactly what they trained me to do, Chief. At least, that's what the 87 weeks at the Defense Information School and the 22 months I spent embedded with infantry units in Afghanistan were supposed to teach me." Afghanistan. Webb's voice carried the particular disdain of a man who'd never met a public affairs officer worth trusting. "Plenty of journalists in Afghanistan. Didn't stop the lies." "No," Vasquez agreed. "It didn't, but some of them tried. I'd like to think I'm one of them." That night, after the briefing, after the tours and introductions and the careful politeness that masked deeper resistance, Elena sat alone in her temporary quarters and pulled out a worn leather journal. She'd carried it through 3 deployments, filling its pages with observations, reflections, questions she couldn't ask aloud. "They don't trust me," she wrote. "They shouldn't. I haven't earned it yet. But I didn't come here to be liked. I came here because someone has to remember what really happens out there. Not the sanitized version, not the heroic narrative, the messy, complicated human truth." She paused, pen hovering over the page. "Dad always said that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's doing the right thing when everyone's watching and doing the same thing when no one is. I don't know yet if these men have that kind of courage. I don't know if I do, but I'm about to find out. Her father had been a Marine, 2 tours in Vietnam, 3 Purple Hearts, and a lifetime of silence about what he'd seen. He'd died when she was 19, leaving behind a folded flag, a box of medals he never displayed, and a daughter who'd spent the rest of her life trying to understand the weight of what he'd carried. She closed the journal and stared at the ceiling until sleep finally came. The weeks before deployment passed in a blur of training exercises, equipment checks, and the slow erosion of outright hostility into something more like grudging tolerance. Vasquez ran every morning with the unit, matching their pace even when her lungs burned and her legs screamed for rest. She sat through tactical briefings without asking questions, absorbing information like a sponge, learning to speak their language before trying to add her voice to the conversation. The men watched her. They were professionals at watching, trained to notice the details that others missed. They noticed that she never complained about the early hours or the brutal PT sessions. They noticed that she handled her assigned weapon, a standard M4 carbine, with the casual competence of someone who'd spent real time on ranges, not just the minimum required for qualification. They noticed that she asked Master Sergeant Brennan about his daughter's college applications, and remembered Hollister's wife was expecting their 3rd child in June. They noticed. But noticing isn't the same as trusting. "She's trying too hard," Webb said one evening in the NCO quarters. "Nobody cares that much unless they want something." Brennan looked up from the letter he was writing to his daughter. "Maybe she just wants to do her job. Her job is making us look good for the cameras, making command look competent, covering up the mistakes that get people killed. You don't know that. I know what public affairs does, Cole. I've seen the reports that come out of these deployments, sterilized, sanitized, all the blood cleaned up so the taxpayers can sleep at night." Brennan folded his letter carefully, placed it in an envelope, and wrote his daughter's name across the front in his careful, deliberate hand. "I've been doing this a long time, Marcus, longer than most. And the one thing I've learned is that people will surprise you. Sometimes they surprise you bad. But sometimes," he shrugged, "sometimes they surprise you good. Either way, you don't know until you're in the thick of it." Webb shook his head. "I know enough." "No," Brennan said quietly. "You know what you want to know. That's different." Forward operating base. Epsilon sat at the edge of the Sahel, where the desert met the scrubland in a long brown line that seemed to stretch to the end of the earth. The base itself was a collection of HESCO barriers, temporary structures, and equipment that looked like it had been assembled from the remnants of 5 different conflicts. Heat rose from the ground in visible waves, turning the distant horizon into a shimmering mirage. Captain Vasquez stepped off the transport aircraft and felt the heat hit her like a physical force. 112 degrees. The air tasted of dust and diesel fuel and something else. Something older. The accumulated residue of centuries of conflict in a land that had known little peace. She'd been in hot places before. Afghanistan in summer. Iraq during the surge. But this was different. This was heat that felt personal, that seemed to be testing her resolve with every breath. "Welcome to paradise, ma'am." Sergeant Webb's voice carried its usual edge, but there was something else there too, something that might have been the beginning of respect, carefully hidden beneath layers of professional skepticism. "It's beautiful," she said, and meant it. The vastness of the landscape, the endless sky, the stark simplicity of a place stripped down to its essential elements. There was a kind of honesty in the desert that you couldn't find anywhere else. Webb looked at her for a long moment, as if seeing something he hadn't expected. Then he shook his head and walked toward the operations center. "Briefing in 30 minutes. Don't be late." The mission was straightforward on paper. They were to provide security support for humanitarian aid convoys moving through the region, deterring the various armed groups that preyed on the vulnerable populations caught between government forces and insurgent factions. It was the kind of assignment that sounded clean in the briefing room and turned complicated the moment boots hit the ground. The first convoy ran without incident, the second as well. By the 3rd week, the men had settled into a rhythm of patrols, checkpoints, and the particular tedium of waiting for something to happen in a place where everything could happen at any moment. Vasquez documented it all, not the dramatic footage that would make for compelling television, but the quiet moments that told the real story. The exhaustion in the men's eyes after a 12-hour patrol, the way they looked out for each other, sharing water and shade, covering each other's blind spots with an instinct that went deeper than training. She noticed other things too. The way local civilians looked at them, not with hostility, but with a kind of weary resignation, as if they'd seen too many foreign soldiers come and go to expect anything to change. The children who gathered at the edges of the base, curious despite their parents' warnings. The women who moved through the markets with their faces half covered, eyes watchful, carrying burdens that went far beyond the baskets balanced on their heads. "You're actually getting good footage," Hollister admitted one evening, watching her review the day's recordings on her laptop. "I expected more, more bullshit." Bullshit doesn't survive contact with reality, Chief. Neither do the stories we tell ourselves about what we're doing here. And what do you think we're doing here? She considered the question seriously, the way she considered everything. "I think you're trying to help. I think command has objectives that may or may not align with that goal. I think the local population has needs that go way beyond what a security convoy can provide. And I think that somewhere in the gap between what we want to accomplish and what we can actually do, there's a truth worth documenting." Hollister was quiet for a moment. "That's a more honest answer than I expected. I'm a more honest person than you expected." "Yeah," he almost smiled. "I'm starting to figure that out." The attack came on a Tuesday, in the gray hour before dawn, when the desert was still cool and the shadows still held some of the night's darkness. They were escorting a convoy of medical supplies to a refugee camp 40 kilometers north of the base when the first RPG streaked out of the rocks and slammed into the lead vehicle. Time fragmented. The explosion. The screaming of metal and men. The sharp crack of automatic weapons fire from multiple directions. And then, training took over, muscle memory and instinct overriding the paralysis of shock. Vasquez was in the third vehicle, a position that gave her a view of the chaos unfolding ahead, while providing some measure of cover. She watched as the operators of 3rd Squadron responded with the precision of men who had done this before, returning fire, assessing casualties, calling in their position and situation on the radio. But something was wrong. She couldn't see it at first. Her perspective was limited, her understanding of tactical situations largely theoretical, despite her time in combat zones. But she could feel it, the way you feel a storm coming before the clouds appear. Something in the pattern of the enemy fire, the way they were positioned around the convoy. This wasn't a hit-and-run attack. This was an ambush designed to pin them down, to trap them in the kill zone while reinforcements moved into position. "Webb!" She keyed her radio, fighting to keep her voice steady. "This is Vasquez, the high ground to the north. There's movement. I count at least 20, maybe more. They're flanking us." Static, then Webb's voice, tight with stress and suppressed anger. "Copy that. We see them, working on it." But they weren't working on it. They couldn't. The initial ambush had wounded 4 men, including the team's primary radio operator and their combat medic. The survivors were pinned down, taking fire from 3 directions, with no clear avenue of retreat and no way to call in air support without the specialized communications equipment that was now burning in the destroyed lead vehicle. Vasquez watched it all happening and felt a kind of terrible clarity descend over her mind. She'd spent her career documenting other people's courage, writing stories about heroes who made impossible choices in impossible situations. Now she was inside one of those situations, and she understood something she'd never fully grasped before. Courage isn't a decision you make once, it's a series of decisions, each one leading to the next, each one harder than the last. She grabbed her rifle, checked that a round was chambered, and crawled out of the vehicle. The fire was immediate and terrifying. Rounds snapped past her head, kicked up dust near her feet, pinged off the metal of the convoy. Vehicles. She ran in a crouch toward the second vehicle, where Master Sergeant Brennan was directing the defense with the calm authority of a man who'd done this more times than he could count. "Brennan!" She dropped beside him, feeling the impact of the ground against her knees and elbows. "We need to call this in. We need air support." "Radio's down." Johnson took a round through the shoulder. "Can't operate the equipment even if it was working." "I can do it." He looked at her, really looked at her, and in that moment something passed between them that went beyond words. An understanding, a recognition. "You're not trained on our comms. I've operated similar equipment in Afghanistan. Different generation, but the principles are the same. And right now, I'm the only option you've got." Brennan glanced toward the burning lead vehicle, toward the northern ridge where the flanking force was moving into position. He made a decision in the space of a heartbeat. "Johnson's in the back of this vehicle. The spare radio is in the case beside him. Get it working, call in our position, and get us some air cover. We'll hold them as long as we can." She didn't hesitate. She moved. The interior of the vehicle was dark and smelled of blood. Specialist Johnson was slumped against the wall, one hand pressed to his wounded shoulder, his face pale with shock and pain. The radio case was beside him, partially open, its contents spilled across the floor in a jumble of cables and components. "Ma'am?" His voice was weak but alert. "What are you doing?" "Getting us out of here." She started sorting through the equipment, her hands moving with a certainty she didn't entirely feel. "Talk me through the setup. What frequency are we on?" He told her, his voice growing steadier as he focused on the task at hand. She assembled the radio, connected the antenna, powered it up. Outside, the firefight continued, the sound of it a constant percussion that seemed to shake the very air. The radio crackled to life. She keyed the handset. Any station, this is Vasquez, Captain, attached 3rd Special Operations Squadron. Troops in contact, request immediate air support. Our position is..." She rattled off the coordinates, the call signs, the details that would transform a garbled distress call into actionable intelligence. She'd listened to 100 such calls during her time in Afghanistan, never imagining she'd be the one making one. The response came after what felt like an eternity, but was probably only seconds. A calm voice, professional, requesting confirmation of position and enemy disposition. She provided what she could, relaying information from Johnson and from what she'd observed herself. "Roger, Vasquez, air support is en route. ETA 12 minutes. Can you mark your position?" 12 minutes. In a firefight, that was a lifetime. But it was something. She crawled back out of the vehicle and found Brennan. "Air support inbound. 12 minutes. He nodded, never taking his eyes off the ridgeline. "Then we hold for 12 minutes. Those 12 minutes stretched and compressed in ways that defied the normal passage of time. Vasquez found herself doing things she'd never imagined doing, helping to drag wounded men to cover, handing ammunition to operators whose own supplies were running low, even taking up a firing position alongside Webb when the flanking force reached the crest of the ridge and began their final approach. She'd qualified on the M4, of course. All officers did. But there was a vast difference between punching holes in paper targets and firing at human beings who were firing back. Her hands shook. Her heart pounded so hard she could feel it in her throat. But she held her position, sent rounds downrange, and watched as the incoming fire answered hers. "Solid shooting for a public affairs officer," Webb shouted over the din, and there was no mockery in his voice now, only something that sounded almost like gratitude. "Solid fighting for a bunch of guys who thought I was here for publicity," she shouted back. He actually laughed, a sharp, incredulous sound that cut through the chaos like a knife. The aircraft arrived at the 11-minute mark. A-10 Warthogs, their distinctive silhouettes appearing over the southern horizon like angels of death. The sound they made, that terrible, beautiful roar of their GAU-8 cannons, was the most welcome thing Vasquez had ever heard. The enemy positions on the ridgeline disappeared in clouds of dust and debris, and suddenly the incoming fire was slackening, the flanking force retreating into the rocks. It was over, or at least the killing part was over. What came after was what always came after: the medevac helicopters, the casualty reports, the long rides back to base in vehicles that felt emptier than they had that morning. 3 men dead, 7 wounded, the convoy destroyed, and 12 survivors who owed their lives to a woman they'd dismissed as a publicity stunt. Vasquez sat alone in the back of the transport vehicle, her rifle across her knees, and felt the adrenaline drain out of her body like water from a broken vessel. Her hands were still shaking. She couldn't make them stop. Brennan sat down beside her. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. "How did you know?" he finally asked. "About the flanking force, before we saw them." She thought about the question. The honest answer was complicated. A combination of pattern recognition, instinct, and the particular awareness that comes from spending years watching combat operations from the outside. But that wasn't what he was really asking. "I've spent my whole career documenting what courage looks like," she said slowly. "I've written about it, photographed it, recorded it, but I never really understood it until today." She looked at her hands, still trembling. "Courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about being afraid and doing what needs to be done anyway. You all do that every day. Today I finally understood what it costs." Brennan was quiet for a moment. Then he reached over and placed his hand over hers, stilling the trembling with a gentle pressure. "What it costs," he said, "is worth it when the people beside you are worth it. Today, you were worth it." The memorial service was held 3 days later, on the parade ground at FOB Epsilon. 3 rifles, 3 helmets, 3 pairs of boots arranged in the ancient formation that honored the fallen. The desert wind was hot and relentless, and the flag snapped against its pole like it was trying to escape. Captain Vasquez stood with the rest of 3rd Squadron, no longer separate, no longer apart. She'd written the official report of the engagement, but she'd also written something else, a longer account, more personal, that captured what she'd witnessed and what she'd felt. It wasn't for the brass or the politicians or the evening news. It was for the families, for the future, for the record of what truly happened on that dusty road in the Sahel. Webb found her after the ceremony, standing alone at the edge of the parade ground, watching the sun set over the desert in shades of orange and gold. "I owe you an apology," he said without preamble. "We all do." "No," she said, "you don't." "We do. We treated you like someone who hadn't proven themselves yet." She turned to face him. "That's not unfair, Sergeant. That's just honest. Trust has to be earned. I knew that when I came here. I knew I'd have to earn my place. You did more than earn it. You saved us. If you hadn't seen that flanking force, if you hadn't gotten that radio working." He stopped, swallowed hard. 3 men died. Without you, it would have been all of us. Vasquez thought about the men who hadn't made it. Specialist Torres, 23, who'd shown her pictures of his baby daughter. Sergeant First Class Williams, who was 6 months from retirement. Private First Class Nguyen, who'd been on his first deployment and had asked her once with the earnest curiosity of youth why she'd chosen a job that put her in danger when she could have stayed safe behind a desk. She hadn't had a good answer then. She did now. "I didn't save anyone," she said quietly. "I did my job, the same job you do, the same job they did." She nodded toward the memorial display. "The only difference is, I get to write about it afterward. I get to make sure people remember." "That's no small thing." "No," she agreed. "It's not." The stars were coming out now, appearing one by one in the darkening sky. The same stars that had watched over 1,000 armies, 1,000 conflicts, 1,000 moments of courage and fear, and everything in between. Webb stood beside her in silence, and for the first time since she'd arrived, it wasn't the silence of exclusion. It was the silence of shared understanding. "I'm going to tell people about you," Vasquez said finally. "When I write about this deployment, not about what I did, about what you all do, every day, the courage it takes to wake up in a place like this and do the job, knowing what it might cost. That's just duty." "No." She turned to look at him, and her eyes held something that went beyond professional respect. "That's what duty looks like to people who don't understand it, to people who've been there, who've held the line when everything was falling apart. It's more than that. It's a choice you make again and again, every single day." Webb was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was rough. "You're not what I expected, Captain. Most things aren't." The deployment continued. The missions went on. And somewhere along the line, without anyone marking the moment or noting the change, Captain Elena Vasquez became part of 3rd Squadron in a way that transcended her official role. She still documented, still recorded, still wrote her reports with the careful attention to truth that had always defined her work. But she also trained with the operators, ate with them, sat with them through the long desert nights when sleep was impossible and conversation was the only antidote to fear. She learned their stories. Brennan's daughter had gotten into Stanford. He carried the acceptance letter in his front pocket, where his body armor would protect it. Hollister's wife had sent him an ultrasound image of their 3rd child, a son who would be born while his father was on the other side of the world. Webb had a sister with cancer who was fighting her own battle, equally dangerous, equally uncertain. They learned hers too. Her father, the Marine who'd carried Vietnam home with him and never put it down. Her mother, who'd raised her alone after the cancer took him, who'd taught her that strength came in different forms. Her own deployments, her own scars, the choices she'd made that had led her here, to this place, to these people. On the last night before their rotation ended, they gathered in the operations center, not for a briefing, but for something simpler. Someone had managed to procure a case of near beer, the non-alcoholic substitute that was the closest they could get to a real celebration in a combat zone. They passed the bottles around, and someone made a toast to the fallen, and for a few hours the weight of it all lifted just enough to breathe. Brennan raised his bottle toward Vasquez, to the captain, who turned out to be a lot more than publicity. The others echoed the toast, and she felt something catch in her throat. Not pride, exactly. Something deeper, something that felt like belonging. "To the truth," she said, raising her own bottle, "which is the only thing worth fighting for." The silence that followed was the kind of silence that holds meaning, the kind that doesn't need to be filled. The plane lifted off from FOB Epsilon at dawn, carrying them back toward home, toward families, toward lives that had continued in their absence. Vasquez sat by a window and watched the desert fall away beneath them, becoming first a landscape, then a map, then a memory. She pulled out her journal, the same worn leather journal she'd carried through 3 deployments, and began to write. "They called me a publicity stunt. They expected cameras and carefully staged shots, sanitized stories that would make the war look clean. They got something else. They got someone who understood that the truth is messier than headlines, that courage is quieter than the movies make it seem, that the real heroes are the ones who never asked to be remembered. I came here to document their story. Instead, I became part of it. That wasn't what I planned. But the best stories never go the way we plan. The best stories are the ones that change us, that break us open and rebuild us into something we didn't know we could become. Dad, if you're watching, I think I finally understand. What you carried, what you couldn't say. The weight of it, the weight of being somewhere like this, doing things like this, and then coming home to a world that can't possibly comprehend what it cost. I understand now, and I'll spend the rest of my life making sure others understand too. She closed the journal and looked out the window at the clouds stretching to the horizon. Somewhere below, in a land of dust and ancient conflicts, the war went on. Other soldiers were waking to another day of patrols and checkpoints and the constant grinding tension of waiting for something to happen. Some of them would make it home, some wouldn't. And some, a precious few, would find themselves tested in ways they never expected, would discover strength they never knew they had, would learn what it means to be more than what others assume. Captain Elena Vasquez had gone to the desert as an outsider, dismissed before she'd even arrived. She was returning as something else entirely. Not a hero. She would never claim that word for herself. But something quieter, something more lasting. A witness, a keeper of truth, a woman who had stood in the fire and found out what she was made of. The medal came later, along with the official recognition and the newspaper stories that reduced the whole complicated truth to a few paragraphs of sanitized heroism. She accepted them with grace, even though they felt like simplifications of something that couldn't be simplified. Awards were for the living. What mattered more was honoring the dead. But the real recognition came in different forms. A letter from Torres's widow, thanking her for the detailed account that helped explain how her husband died. A phone call from Williams's brother, who said that reading her report was like finally understanding who his brother had become. An email from Nguyen's mother, written in halting English, expressing gratitude for the photo Vasquez had taken of her son just days before the ambush. Smiling, young, alive. These were the moments that mattered. These were the truths worth preserving. Years later, when she'd risen to the rank of colonel and was overseeing public affairs for an entire theater of operations, Elena Vasquez would sometimes pull out that worn leather journal and read what she'd written in the Sahel. The words had faded with time, but the memories hadn't. They never would. She'd learned something in that desert that went beyond tactics or duty or even courage. She'd learned that the walls we build between us, the assumptions, the judgments, the categories we use to sort each other into boxes are nothing compared to the bonds we forge when those walls come down. She'd learned that being underestimated is not the same as being defeated. She'd learned that the truth, the real truth, is always worth fighting for. And she'd learned that sometimes the people who save us are the ones we never expected. The soldiers of 3rd Squadron scattered after that deployment, as soldiers always do. Some retired, some transferred. Some went on to other wars, other conflicts, other moments of truth in places the newspapers would never mention. But they carried the story with them, passing it down to younger operators like a sacred trust. There was this captain, they'd say. Public affairs. Everyone thought she was just there for the cameras. And then they'd tell the rest of it. The ambush, the radio, the 12 minutes that felt like eternity. The woman who'd crawled through fire to save them, when no one expected her to be anything more than a spectator. The story grew in the telling, as stories do. But the truth at its heart remained unchanged. Courage doesn't announce itself. It doesn't ask for recognition or demand respect. It simply appears, when it's needed, in the people who choose to answer the call. Elena Vasquez never thought of herself as a hero. She thought of herself as a witness, someone whose job was to see clearly and remember accurately and tell the truth when the truth was hard. But sometimes, being a witness requires more than watching. Sometimes it requires stepping out from behind the camera, picking up a rifle, and becoming part of the story you came to tell. Sometimes the witness becomes the hero, whether she wants to or not. And sometimes, just sometimes, that's exactly how it's supposed to be. The desert remembers. The sand holds the footprints of every soldier who ever walked its expanse, if only for a moment. The wind carries the voices of those who spoke into it, whispered prayers and shouted orders and quiet confessions made to an empty sky. And somewhere in that vast repository of memory, there's a trace of what happened on that dusty road. The day a woman they dismissed as a publicity stunt proved that courage comes in forms we don't always recognize, that heroes emerge when we least expect them, and that the truth, told honestly and completely, is the most powerful weapon any of us can carry. She's just here for publicity, they said, until she saved them all. This story isn't about war. It's about the people who fight, them, the truths they carry, and the quiet courage that makes survival possible. It's about the walls we build and the moments that tear them down. It's about the unexpected places we find ourselves and the unexpected people we become. The Valor Archive exists to preserve these moments, not as spectacle, but as truth, not as propaganda, but as memory. Because courage like this shouldn't be forgotten. It should be passed on, story by story, life by life, until it becomes part of who we are, until it reminds us what we're capable of, until it shows us who we might become.